J.Crew was once a family-owned company built to incredible popularity. And yet, it wasn't the mastermind of one person, far from it. Over the years, several people have helmed the brand to varying success, but today, it's finally reached its long-anticipated end. At least, that's how it seems. A very large amount of information in this video comes from this book by Maggie Bullock. I usually get my information from as many sources as possible, but as I tried to research deeper, I only found how comprehensive Bullock's book was. I will still keep the sources in the top right because there are more than one, so you can tell for certain for yourself, but I just wanted to say this initially because it was such a good book. I highly recommend it to you, and I will put a link down where I usually have the books. So, to begin the history of J.Crew, it's probably best to take you back to the 1950s. The idea of at-home selling had just taken off, and brands like Tupperware and Avon were doing serious numbers in retailing. This new retail format of having in-home demonstrations of products sold by a local person, usually a housewife to other housewives, was the retail du jour. And it was in this environment that Mitchell Sinider and his cousin Saul Charles were trying to make their way in a company begun all the way back in 1947 that sold cheap goods such as sweets, towels, sweatsuits, VCRs, basically anything they thought their customers would want, all under the name Popular Club Plan, which was owned by their company, Popular Merchandise Incorporated. Their target market was towards the poorer end of consumers, and as such offered an installment purchasing plan for customers, spreading the burden of their purchases over the course of several months. This, in fact, was their differentiator back in the 1950s. Now, this company was not the start of J.Crew. It was a totally separate business. However, it would over time introduce the Sinider family to the world of fashion retailing and would open them up to noticing changes in the market. Fast forward then to around 1981 to Mitchell Sinider's son, Arthur Sinider, who was then running the family company. At this point, Popular Merchandise Incorporated was turning over about $50 million, but was quite frustrated because their installment purchasing plan came with huge administrative costs processing small monthly payments. That's when a man named Ted Pamperin walks through the door. Pamperin wasn't really here to discuss their payment plan, but instead introduces Mitchell to a new way to cut out the middleman, i.e. the salesperson hosting the at-home sales parties, and instead proposes to deliver catalogs directly to the consumer as opposed to a host via a mailing list. This had newly been made possible due to several factors, including the new popularity of credit cards allowing immediate phone payments. Secondly, because of the newly established 800 numbers made American long-distance calls free, and the fact that the US Postal Service was newly operating in 48 states. This was exactly the kind of business setup that could flourish under all these changes, and Pamperin knew it. It also didn't have many competitors, and because Popular Merchandise Incorporated was already similar both in structure and in size to the business model Pamperin was proposing, i.e. they already sent products via the mail to the customers, and they could easily translate their logistics with less difficulty than others because they weren't too big yet. Both the men knew it would be expensive to set up the cataloging, but it was the perfect storm. How could they say no? The only problem was, what would they sell? Pamperin came up with two options. Number one was selling computers and computer parts. It was a booming industry in the 80s already, and if they were looking to grow, this would certainly be an easy way to do so. Or number two was selling clothing, something they had previously done, but now had a new perspective on it with the incoming trend of prep. Quote, Pamperin recalls this as a decision based not on a passion for fashion or for prep, but on straight business sense. Popular Club Plan knew how to source, how to photograph, and how to sell apparel. Prep was a new word for an old term. In short, it was the old money aesthetic, but all the way back in the 80s. Of course, even then the style wasn't new. Even the term had been used since the late 1800s to describe this jacket and tie dress codes of the college prep set as a style. This iteration of the trend in 1981 was already dominated by brands like Ralph Lauren, Lacoste, and Brooks Brothers, who'd all been going decades already, but were newly seeing popularity in the mainstream after the surprise success of a book named The Official Preppy Handbook. It had sold 2 million copies and spent 38 weeks on the New York Times bestseller list, thrusting the trend into very quick popularity. But the thing to know about this is that because the trend was so old and so highbrow, there was no outlet for a lower price point, even though the style had been around for such an incredibly long time. Now with this new popularity, first companies flocked to fill the need of the market in the mid-luxury space, think Tommy Hilfiger, as that tends to offer a larger markup for not a lot of extra costs than a cheaper brand. But at this point in 1981, the trend didn't yet have anything at the affordable price point, i.e. the People Popular Club plan already had experience selling fashion too. As a result, they had insight into what would sell, namely Ralph Lauren but logoless and in a good enough quality to allow for the huge reduction on price that their target market could afford. Soon they had their logistics set up to fill their niche, and all they needed was a name that sounded as haughty as they were pretending it to be. Eventually they settled on J.Crew, most likely because of its connection to the collegiate sport of crew, but it was also Arthur Sinider who came up with the backstory of the company as a way to ensure the company didn't look like a phony. After all, Arthur, having been to Yale himself, knew that it was heritage that really sold the brand to the uni students, and as such would be a huge selling factor to any target market they may have, but more specifically to the same collegiate target market. To keep costs low and to see if J.Crew as a brand had staying power, their first products were private labeled garments, i.e. garments designed and made by a totally separate factory and just labeled under the J.Crew brand. These were then sold in the J.Crew branded catalogues next to the more established brands like Sperry, Woolrich, and Boston Traders, who offered the perception of authenticity through proximity but didn't directly compete with J.Crew due to their pre-decided lower price point. Eventually by 1983, their first catalogue was ready after 2 years of work, and J.Crew put out their first offering of extremely basic but commercially viable garments sold purely on the lower price, the origin story, and some great photography work in the catalogue from Michael Belk. The first catalogue was then sent out to 10,000 Americans, and J.Crew prepared itself for orders. But they had no idea that they had just struck true gold. The response was immediate and astounding. They had so many orders they were forced to issue gift cards to those whose orders they just could not fill. Within only 18 months, they had already broken even. Within the year, catalogue production was taken in-house, and a new CEO named Carrie Stone was hired to make sure Emily Sinider, who had unofficially been with the company since inception but that I have yet to tell you about, was really prepared to take over as president of the company one day. Emily may have only unofficially been at the company, but a large part of their decision to go the route of selling prep had been based on her proximity to the origins of the style, being that she was collegiate age and attending an Ivy League university. She may not have dressed preppy herself. As a Jewish woman, she was largely excluded from the style due to anti-Semitism, but that wouldn't stop her from understanding the trend's core values from her university. As such, it was directly Emily's perspective that would curate J.Crew's point of view. Slowly at first, of course, they had begun with private label garments, so that was much more difficult to have control over, but by 1983, so the same year, her value at the company had already proved to be irreplaceable. You see, it was already in that first year, the company was valued at $2 million, and it fell to Emily to foresee that in order for the business to have longevity, they would need their own image, not just to be Diet Ralph Lauren. She began with hiring new models, new photographers, new locations for the catalogue photo shoots, and interiorly with new managerial staff, namely Tierney Horn, who was then an assistant editor at Vogue that Emily had known previously. But still, it wasn't easy to poach her to a career step down from making beautiful Vogue magazine layouts to making catalogues, and in fact, she had to quadruple her current salary in order to convince her to jump. But Emily was certainly heading this very large-scale revamp, and her talents were paramount to that process. By 1984, J.Crew had already cemented its own brand image because of Emily. It was the catalogue that now looked and read like a fashion magazine that would really set them apart from anybody else in the space. By 1985, they had their own in-house design team headed by Linda Snyder, with Claire McDonald on knits and Lisa Antasny on sweatshirts, all of whom just made very slight alterations on existing preppy staples, with an emphasis on how they felt to the wearer, not how they looked externally. And within that, I mean specifically they made them better fitting, more stylish, more comfortable. The growth was magic, according to the VP of Marketing Charlie Silver, who told Maggie Bullock in her book that the only constraints were functional. Did they have sufficient warehouse space, a strong enough supply chain, a big enough telemarketing staff to keep up with the demand that would inevitably come from sending out more catalogues? So they had an incredible launch. The first few years at the company were unlike anything they could possibly have expected. But of course, hedging all of your bets on one specific fashion style lends that when the style quietens, so does the whole business. And it wasn't long, by 1989 to be exact, even actually before the term preppy had fallen out of style, that J.Crew's once explosive 25-30% year-on-year growth had slowed to 15% by 1990. The fashion was still selling, and their more accessible take on prep was now truly famous because they didn't raise their prices like Ralph Lauren had. Their brand got haughtier while J.Crew stayed very grounded, and for that reason it felt more authentic. And yet the times were changing. They used that famous Cylinder perception and knew that it was time for them to pivot. This would begin what the book calls J.Crew 3.0. 3.0 begins with Emily distilling the ideas of J.Crew's brand identity. It was authentic, it was timeless, it was good taste for the masses, and most importantly, it was American. Through this, J.Crew pivoted in two ways, which if you are a major J.Crew fan, you should know that these both happened just before the Linda Evangelista shoot that pretty much legitimized J.Crew as a serious fashion offering. Firstly, their product offering, and secondly, their place of purchase. For product offering, they still targeted the same demographic, but the original teens had now aged up into being working men and women themselves. So, to target them more appropriately, they released what was called a Classics collection, which was staple polished pieces that one could wear to the office. Then, when this went well, they also released a collection named Collection that was much more upscale, luxury pieces to meet the demand. While for place of purchase, this actually was just far more complex. You see, the world of cataloging was already dying by the 1990s, with a plateau in growth from 1888 despite 12.5 billion catalogs being delivered to American households in that same year. So to compete, they again just followed an established trend, this time with the prevalence of malls. But the problem with that was, malls were already very well established by this point. Cliques of shoppers had already formed, and the competition in the market, much like cataloging, was already very well saturated. But frankly, if they stayed with cataloging and didn't move into malls, they were sure to die. And they knew this. They literally had no choice but to move into malls. A man named Arnie Cohen was brought in to oversee this expansion, which they wanted to be quick and expansive. But being smart about it, they opened a primary store in New York to just test the waters, and after that proved to be ridiculously successful, allowed them to charge a premium to customers for their new minimalist style, which saw them once again in fashion. This was also boosted by their incredible quality, with walls from Loro Piana and Zegna Barufa even in their classics range. Their quality was as high as any designer brands, while being a third of the price. However, while the stores were supposedly quickly financially profitable and had helped J.Crew escape the bankruptcy that was sure if they had stuck to cataloging, it didn't really help this change in public perception that was so necessary. J.Crew publicly was still a catalog company that just happened to have stores. It could have helped change the public perception with time, obviously, but because of internal conflicts, namely Arnie was treating the stores like they were cannibalizing the profits and sales from the catalogs, while Emily was unwilling to cut any corners to ensure a sooner break-even point, it ended up in a very uncomfortable working environment in which they couldn't help to change that public perception. Eventually, Cohen found the environment too unhealthy, and he left in 1993 with only 36 stores open, which was about 3/5 of what they had actually envisioned. The company itself was doing okay though. It had survived the transition from cataloging to retail and from preppy to minimalism. But competition was already ramping up. Abercrombie & Fitch, Banana Republic, Old Navy, and Gap. There were so many more competitors in the affordable preppy market than J.Crew had ever had to face before. To combat this changing landscape, J.Crew repositioned to a slightly more mid-market positioning, held an older target market than, say, Abercrombie & Fitch, and had better product quality than Gap, successfully differentiating themselves as a company. They began opening more stores across America to the tune of 15 a year. They were growing slowly, just simply waiting for their next big break. This brings us to Brian Sugar. During his university years in 1996, a chap named Brian Sugar had developed mock-ups for companies for a new idea he had about turning catalog businesses into online sales businesses. Exactly like a catalog, just one that customers could shop on their computer. And he had sent this idea off to various cataloging companies in the hopes of a response, one of which was sent to J.Crew. It was Arthur Synoder Jr., so Emily's brother, not her father, who found Sugar's CD in the drawer of the newly fired CIO and decided to call the boy for an interview in their newly established New York headquarters. Arthur loved the idea. The internet was still new though, and nobody else at J.Crew took it seriously. Literally, it seems the only reason he was given a shot was because Arthur was Arthur's son, and as such was granted a tiny team to plan the online expansion. This included himself, Brian, and just one intern to, quote, put up a starter site, really just a landing page. Customers could request a catalog or type in an item code into a little box to place an order. It had limited ability to search or to filter items by category, and it shut down for 10 to 12 hours a night. But Sugar was determined. To him, it was a race to get online. LL Bean had already set up a site, and word was that Gap.com was coming very soon. Not to skip ahead, but they beat Gap to the punch by only months in December 1996. This was the same year that ended in sales of up to $808 million, credited to Arthur Sr. and to Emily's blood, sweat, tears, and ahem, family money. Now in his 70s, it was time for Arthur to exit. It's just the only way for him to do that and to keep Emily in charge was to sell a chunk of the company to an outside investor who would be able to provide the money that Emily needed to buy out her father's chunk in the company. Quote, that summer's investor meetings were like speed dates. At each stop, the J.Crew delegation would buy breakfast for a group of suits and proceed to sell them point by point on the world of J.Crew. Its cult status, its legions of adoring fans, its business model and earnings. Finance bros were less interested in the gestalt than the potential payout. Could J.Crew scale? Could it grow large enough to be taken public in an IPO that would pay back their investment many times over? The number one question at every stop, how big can J.Crew get? The worry here was profit, because despite sales being $808 million, they were really only seeing between $14 million in 1994 and $12.5 million in 1996 in comfortable profit. What they've been doing is reinvesting all of the money they made in sales to grow the company, which is a fantastic thing. It got them to real success and helped them to expand to the size that they had. But to a shareholder who is only interested in payouts, this isn't exactly an enticing strategy. And it didn't help that because of Arthur's abrasive manner of doing business, the churn rate of top-level executives was kind of high, directly costing them a lucrative investment deal with Investcorp, which is the company with stakes in Saks and Gucci. With that said, they did eventually find exactly what they were looking for from a company called the Texas Pacific Group. They sold them a 60% majority stake of 560 million US dollars. 125 million of which came directly from the Texas Pacific Group, and the rest they took from bank loans and high-interest bonds, though this was mostly done to protect themselves if anything went south in terms of sales or profits, which makes sense really. Fashion is particularly volatile in that sense. In the deal, quote, Emily retained 12% of the company with the option to buy more. She was getting a $10 million signing bonus plus a 5-year contract for $5 million, which would double if business improved. As for Arthur, it seemed that he had retired. Everything at J.Crew changed. It became very corporate and money-focused right from the jump. It effectively was no longer the family-run business that had made working there so exciting for so many people. Now it was streamlining. They dropped off 10% of the staff, and they were pushing for unending growth between 97 and the millennium. Howard Sokol was brought in as the new CEO in 98. He cut the collection, tweaked stores, and tried to bring in a department store-esque feeling that just didn't really sit too well. In fact, a lot of what Sokol and the Texas Pacific Group were trying to do really didn't sit too well with the world building of J.Crew, and it ended up falling on Emily's shoulders to steer the company back to the J.Crew way. This ended up bolstering a rival between Emily and Sokol that had become so tangible that in the end, Texas Pacific Group, who now owned 85%, ended up bringing in management consultants to assess who was the aggressor. Turns out it was Howard Sokol, and in January 1999, he was out. Following Howard came Mark Savary, who oversaw a large string of financially motivated changes. Production costs lowered, as had advertising costs, stores were ever growing, now to over 100, and most importantly, the bottom line was up. But all of that came at a great cost. They lost their famed product quality, no more supermodels in their catalogs and campaigns for customers to talk about, and they even lost Emily, who was ousted from her job. J.Crew, despite profits, was no longer J.Crew. A scathing review in the New York Times came in that April 2002, listing how J.Crew had lost its way, and Mark also ended up leaving the following month. By late 2002, J.Crew was in an awful place. Profits were all well and good, sure, but without that needed brand identity for customers to buy into, profits can be very short-lived. They tried a new CEO in Ken Pilot, but given that they were already looking at bankruptcy due to a total drop-off of sales and a string of failed attempts at selling the company to all of Abercrombie & Fitch, Liz Claiborne, and American Eagle, the last of which for only $500 million, the writing was clearly on the wall for J.Crew. Bankruptcy was their only option. But instead of that, a miracle happened. Mickey Drexler, the man that had managed to turn around Ann Taylor and Gap, had recently just been fired from Gap, and he was now a free agent with something to prove. And he was willing to invest $10 million of his own money into J.Crew to prove it. Mickey's view of J.Crew was fundamentally different. He was less concerned with immediate profits and was more concerned with long-term gains, the same perspective that Emily had had way back in the 80s. And so he reframed the company basically back to coming at retail from a customer perspective as opposed to a financial perspective. He enlisted the help of then head women's wear designer Jenna Lyons and a woman named Gail Spanos to get rid of the ugly. And together they very quickly transformed the brand and its product offering into one that was truly branded as J.Crew once again. Mickey Drexler was ruthless, but was brilliant. He axed sales, reformatted stores, returned the catalogs to host beautiful shoots once again. They streamlined stockists, reduced product selection to what was actually good as opposed to exclusively what sold well. They reintroduced the product quality that J.Crew had once been known for, including leaking the fact that they used Laura Piana walls in the press. They launched full-scale PR and marketing department from which they hired many big-hitting names in the business, and they kept the people that understood the essence of J.Crew over anything else. By 2004, the company was already back on its feet, and by 2006, it was already ready to go public. Quote, J.Crew's IPO was a landslide victory. At the time, the second richest opening day of any retailer ever to go public in the United States. JCG had been projected at $15 to $17. It closed its first day at $25.55, meaning that $10 million that Mickey had put down personally was now worth $136 million US. And Emily, who had still remained as a shareholder, was about to become $100 million richer after she sold her shares about 6 months later, cutting the final tie between J.Crew and the original Senator family. So, now with public shareholders, profit became more necessary than ever. But also, by 2007, the shopping mall was dying, and J.Crew was very heavily invested in brick-and-mortar stores. However, extremely fortunately, because Mickey had learned his lesson about overexpanding from Gap, he had not conducted an aggressive store rollout, putting them in a significantly better position than their direct competitors. They had as many stores as the whole company could fund operating, while J.Crew had focused on the profit-making stores, closing those that didn't have a favorable turnover in isolation, as opposed to as a group with the other stores under the name. Simultaneously, in 2007, the consumer market was changing once again. Now, demand was refocusing away from preppy style onto more flashier, fashion-led clothing purchased largely based on price, actually. Consumer demand in this respect was divided. They either had extremely price-inflated designer clothes that one could save up to buy, or they were purchasing extremely cheap high street goods that were largely impulse purchased. But knowing that J.Crew couldn't compete with either of these, they prepared themselves for a plateau in growth and doubled down on consistency. Meanwhile, to survive this period, J.Crew bought Madewell, an old woodwear factory begun in 1937 that allowed J.Crew as a parent company to meet the changing consumer demands without needing the original J.Crew to change its DNA. I'm not going to go into Madewell as a company in this video because it really does just deserve its own video somewhere down the line, but that is the effect that it had on J.Crew. It allowed the company to stay afloat in changing times without losing the essence of J.Crew. But of course, Drexler cannot solely be credited with all of this success, as it was Jenna Lyons who instinctively knew how to adapt their style into the late 2000s, and together with Gail Spanos was really trusted with overseeing all of the design as well as most of, if not all, of the visual communication of the company. It was really she that developed the new J.Crew look for which they were so successful, probably most famously after their unexpected endorsement from Michelle Obama. As a result, it was Lyons who saw that J.Crew, the brand, narrowly avoided the late 2000s recession. Rightfully, by 2010, she was made president and creative director of J.Crew, taking over from Tracy Gardner. Jenna, now with overt control, acted really quickly. She changed the website to an authentic and trendy blog, changed the catalogs to style guide-like magazines. Jumping ahead, she updated the logo and was even soon to take them to New York Fashion Week for their debut in Spring/Summer 12. But still in the timeline of 2010, Mickey was still the man in charge of the business and the parent company. It was at this time that he was approached by two men for a rather daring plan. Jonathan Sokolov, then partner at Leonard Greener Partners, and Jim Coulter, then co-founder of the Texas Pacific Group, proposed that J.Crew could re-privatize under their investment in order to restructure for even further growth. Of course, they all went for it, and by November 2010, in a leveraged buyout, J.Crew re-privatized, valuing J.Crew at $2.86 billion US. But it was extremely messy. Literally, it landed Mickey Drexler in court for how it went down, but the reprivatization did go through in March 2011 for just under $3 billion US. By 2013, they had $2.4 billion in revenue, and by 2014, they had 400 mostly profitable stores in all of the UK, US, and Canada. In fact, it was perfect time for their second IPO. But of course that would never happen. And instead, this is where we begin to see the start of the end of J.Crew. Their problem was that they had grown to such a size that their logistics were slow. Before, when the company changed to this model, their small size allowed them to be nimble. But now, as fashions had changed away from the Jenna Lyons branded look of the 2010s into normcore, the company just didn't have the agility to swing in the right direction in a timely manner. Frankly, because of fast fashion, both mid-market and luxury brands were now expected to be on an ever-turning, ever-churning cycle of fashion, forever giving something new to the customer, regardless of the cost. But without the right logistics to follow suit, many of the old-school big brands just began to crash, and J.Crew, of course, was one of them. Naturally, they tried to pivot back to their classic J.Crew look to meet this normcore demand, but it flopped. They were too late and managed to alienate some of their remaining customers in the process, all while still dragging their heels of being online. Plus, the fact that they were now battling rising customer complaints that prices had risen too high and quality had dipped too low, it didn't help their continually falling sales. Quote, "On the face of things, J.Crew had a killer website, it looked gorgeous, won awards for visuals and tone, but they weren't putting in the back-end investment it would have taken to keep it on the leading edge. And by 2014, the site was only one piece of the digital puzzle. Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, Google, YouTube, Snapchat each required a custom approach. Each had a slightly different audience. TikTok would dawn in 2016. In the fast-paced, shoot-from-the-hip social media era, J.Crew was showing its age. Social media had moved the goalposts of authenticity yet again. Now, every communique from a brand had to feel intimate, immediate, and crucially, spontaneous, transparent, real. It was not until December 2014 that J.Crew's dual identity, glowing success in the public, increasing cause for worry in private, was made public. After 11 years of upward growth and right on the heels of the company's single greatest year, Mickey found himself explaining bad news. J.Crew had plunged in a single year from a net income of more than $35 million to making a loss of nearly $608 million. Now desperate, it was Mickey Drexler who came up with the solution to refocus the company back to lower prices and to basics, opening up factory outlets to make for any losses that they may have had, heavily reducing product prices in stores, and asking Jenna Lyons to reduce her role from the public spotlight that had served the brand so well between 2010 and 2013. However, while this saved J.Crew in the short term, J.Crew was becoming Mickey's own worst nightmare. A premium product customers were trained never to buy at full price. This was then mixed with criticisms that the brand wasn't authentic anymore, that they didn't have full size ranges, being that they stopped at an American 12, which is between a 14 and a 16 in England, and a release of more out there styles that didn't resonate with their remaining customers who were still looking for preppy looks, even if it didn't go by that name anymore. By 2015, sales were really down. Jobs were cut, and they were $1.5 billion in debt, mostly because of shareholder payouts. They literally just had no room to weather the storm. It was either to make money now and quickly, or put the company into bankruptcy. And to be frank, with all the recent changes, they no longer had a differentiator between themselves and their competitors. By 2017, it was leaked to the press that Jenna Lyons was jumping ship, and because of their close working dynamic, Mickey wasn't far behind either, leaving in 2019. They were replaced by Somsak Sikkenmong as creative director and wildcard Jim Brett as CEO. Quote, Jim Brett's tenure was as disastrous as Mickey predicted. Brett took a wild swing, as if he believed all of J.Crew's problems could be fixed in one fell swoop. He cut prices, widened size ranges, launched feel-good charitable initiatives, built a fleet of new, lower-priced ranges, and struck up in a partnership with Amazon and alienated a huge swath of their staff. Almost all of Brett's changes went live in one high-speed stretch in September 2018. 2 months later, he was out after 17 months. After Brett, there was an interim board established until January 2020 when Jan Singer took over as CEO and helped the company through filing for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. They shut their 6 stores in the UK and were approved for having their debts cut due to closure from coronavirus, despite obviously being heavily in debt before. Though this did have the massive benefit of ridding the company from Leonard Green and from the Texas Pacific Group, who were their private investors previously. By November 2020, Libby Waddle took over from Jan Singer and helped oversee their US mall stores be turned into COVID vaccine clinics to basically just survive. This also saw a new investor, Anchorage Capital Partners, invest a much more manageable $400 million due by 2027, and they hired a new group of designers, including promoting Olympia Gayet, who, according to her LinkedIn, is now creative director and executive VP of women's wear and kids for the label. This is the state of revival that the company is in today. I usually say that I'm interested to see where a brand will go or that I hope for the future, but actually for J.Crew, mostly I just wonder where they see their differentiator, unless it's just heritage through which they're selling to customers. Because to me, it doesn't look a ton different to, say, Mango or Banana Republic. I do know that it's hard to differentiate in this world of prep, especially when it's out of style, though with the new money aesthetic being a trend recently, it shouldn't have been that difficult. Except, of course, there is so much more competition in this space that it's hard for them to compete, even with the legacy that they have. On that note, I was watching Christian's video, Is J.Crew Cool Again, on his channel Brave New Wear, and he goes through kind of why he feels that J.Crew has evolved their style, specifically with menswear, into something that's more desirable today. He goes through positives, obviously, and negatives, but mostly he just kind of says that it's subversive because that's not the current popular trend of, t-shirts and more casual styles. It's interesting that he likens their dip in popularity to the rise in kind of streetwear prep in brands like Noah, ALD, Golf Le Fleur, and I was even thinking maybe Casablanca could fit into that realm of nouveau prep that they just aren't hitting. He then also goes on to say how they are making a more casual fit in some of their menswear styles in a way that reminds me a bit of 90s Armani. It's really unstructured blazers, etc. And I wonder if this is a route they could go down. Maybe they could use the menswear to try and get some loyalty, who then will grow from there. I mean, that's how Jenna Lyons began at the company. It does make sense if they try to regain success through the menswear. But it's difficult. There's so many brands today. There's so much competition. It reminds me of a quote from Jean-Paul Gaultier in Fashionopolis. Too much fashion kills fashion. Though I suppose in their case, it's too much prep kills prep. Regardless, I kind of do hope they figure out what they need. I never really wish bad for any company. And with the legacy that they have, they do at least deserve to find their groove once again. And I'm sure they will. There's a lot of money behind the brand and a lot of people willing to keep it going. But maybe they just have to wait until the time is right. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you liked it, please do subscribe and like the video as well. If you're interested in videos like this, but about beauty brands, my beauty channel Underskin is linked here, and a special thank you to my patrons, some of whose names are on the screen now. All content used in this video is done so in accordance with the principles of fair use. However, if you have any concerns, please contact me directly at contact@understitch.co.uk.